Thank you very much, Patricia, and good evening, everybody. As you can tell, the concept of competitiveness is a contestable one. David makes a reference to Sean O'Ryan, who I used to play darts with in the SRI in the early 1990s, and prescient used to be part of his vocabulary during that phase. The other issue that was I'm mindful of is Paul Krugman's prescience. Paul Krugman has famously wrote the book in 1989 called The Age of Diminished Expectations, that America would never again be able to claim its full power in the world, and then the next decade proved that wrong. So if you live long enough, you see everything. This afternoon I want to address the question, can we get back to being competitive again? The answer is yes, and we are. Okay. I might stop at that, but I presume you'd like me to elaborate just a little bit. It's been obvious for a number of years that Ireland's competitiveness has become seriously eroded. The difficulties facing the traded sectors in the economy were largely ignored by policymakers in the face of buoyant employment growth and tax revenue arising from an overheating domestic economy. As the ECB President, Mr Trichet, recently pointed out here in Ireland, it is clear that the government and others, myself included, mistook the bubble for a structural improvement in the Irish economy. Not all of that structural improvement, however, is a bubble, and will be shown to be so. And one of the things I think that would help in our debate is that if our educational system was for anything, it is to see the difference between a level and a growth rate. I see George Lee here, and I congratulate him on his elevation into heaven, it would appear, by the acolytes that surround him now, is that one of the fundamental things in economics is that it's actually a very baseless subject, because most of the conversation takes place about growth rates on the way up and the way down. And there's a failure to see where a society has reached a level. And that absolute sense of the level is that a lot of what we talk about are relative changes from levels that we've achieved. And I think that's important to bear in mind. What's happening to our economy at the moment is a move back from an exceptionally high level to one that is still a very palatable one, and one that actually still provides us with lots of choices, and choices that we can make that are still under our own control. So all stakeholders should at this point, but don't, accept that economic recovery can only be achieved through a restoration of this relative concept of competitiveness and the reinvigoration of the net trade position on which our living standards will ultimately depend. And this will result from growth in exports of goods and services. I think in essence what we've seen today is that competitiveness is essentially determined by three main factors. The trade-weighted exchange rate, our cost base, and something I really want to stress, our productivity potential. In past crises, Ireland has been able to address much of its competitiveness in the short term through currency devaluation. But the impacts of this in the history shows us that these were always short-term solutions. It bought you time before you had to actually make the real adjustments. And in fact, you could spend a lot of years, and we did, in the 1979 up to the 80s, believing that we could devalue our way back into competitive positions and to restore the real adjustments that were crying out. It may be useful in this occasion if we actually don't have that third part, that we don't have a devaluation option, and therefore we have to concentrate on the cost containment and productivity improvement part. A range of factors will impact on this. At a business level, what really matters is the unit cost of the goods and services that we sell compared to those of our competitors when we get them to the export markets. A range of factors will impact upon those unit costs. Innovation, I would argue, is actually the most crucial of all. And that is where I think we have a huge amounts of strengths and things that we have to be important that we nurture and don't lose sight of that. But also process improvements, workplace flexibility, and of course wage costs. All are important factors. Much of the debate here this week has focused on the issue of wage costs in isolation, and has probably lacked sufficient input on the other factors which impact upon the unit output costs. It's impossible to ignore the importance of wage costs in determining competitive levels, but I plan to devote equal attention to the non-wage issues in today's deliberations. A number of other European countries have had significant competitiveness problems in recent times and in recent decades. In the early 1990s, both Sweden and Finland suffered severe financial and economic crises, similar to what Ireland is currently experiencing, and over recent months a number of domestic commentators have chosen to look at these economies and see what the key factors in their economic recovery were. Well, what we'll find is that in a degree both countries relied on currency devaluations as part of the mix to restore their competitiveness. as was indicated, that is not an option open to us. Finland in particular also made another important decision at the height of its economic crisis, which greatly strengthened its competitive position. Its programme for fiscal consolidation involved spending cuts in all major programme areas with the exception of one. The one exception was in science, technology and innovation. In fact, at a time when its public finances were in disarray, it proceeded with plans to increase investment in research and development. This has paid rich dividends in the following years as the resulting competitiveness benefits position the country to strongly take advantage of the global economic recovery. Albeit due to different reasons, Germany experienced a similar bout of weak competitiveness in the mid-1990s. In the run-up to monetary union, devaluation was not desirable. One of the short pieces in economic history that's often forgotten, the German currency devalued only once in its lifetime. It devalued to the Irish pound just before EMU. A fact we don't praise ourselves enough for. So to remind in these dark days of economic misery that we had one victory once. This period of nominal wage growth and productivity improvement ultimately resulted in real unit labour cost reductions. How the Germans did it was strong wage growth in other countries meant that an effective nominal pay freeze was sufficient for Germany to restore its competitive position. Nevertheless, the adjustment took place over a decade and resulted in a significant erosion in real living standards in Germany. It subsequently improved its competitive position, but much of the benefits of recovery have temporarily been stifled in Germany by the current global economic downturn. The challenge facing Ireland at the moment is actually more daunting than for Sweden, Finland or Germany in those periods. Firstly, as I've indicated before, there is no currency devaluation option. Secondly, the poor short-term international economic outlook and the prospect of global deflation mean that the German option of nominal wage freeze is unlikely to yield sufficient benefits. And thirdly, the Irish economy is much more open and so will suffer more or gain more from changes in competitiveness than any of the three countries before mentioned. In recent months, many economists have argued for a sharp reduction in nominal wages in Ireland. Labour costs here have grown far more rapidly than our main trading partners and are currently well above the EU 15 average. The timing for such an adjustment, it is argued, it may be right as consumer prices are set to fall, particularly in the CPI terms, by 5% on average in 2009. And in the next couple of months, we'll actually probably see significantly higher rates of falls in the CPI in the autumn of this year, given the base effects of last. And it is also still remains the case that it's forecast to decline further in 2010, thereby offers the potential to cushion the impact of wage cuts on living standards. Over the past decade, Germany demonstrated how competitiveness could be restored with minimal and nominal wage increases during a period of moderate inflation and a relatively strong wage growth in its trading partners. However, in order for Ireland to achieve a similar improvement, we're looking at a case of a time of price deflation and exceptionally low wage growth in other countries, so that cuts in nominal wages are inevitably required to achieve the same competitive gain as Germany. At the core of Ireland's competitive difficulties is a trend in the cost of doing business here vis-à-vis our two main trading partners. A combination of euro strength and high wage growth has meant that the competitive position that Ireland had against the United Kingdom and the United States have been sharply reversed in recent years. The competitive position against the UK has been worsened considerably further since the autumn of 2008, as the value of sterling has remained weak and is now 20% lower than it was 18 months ago. Such a competitive disadvantage is simply not sustainable in the medium term, and the full impacts of this have still not played out in our economy and are becoming evident by the week as we see indigenous companies beginning to suffer quite dramatically. And some of the more high-profile ones of this week are not indigenous companies, but are showing that the high cost base in trying to trade into other markets is becoming a burden that Irish industry cannot bear. The advantage provided to the manufacturing sector in the UK as a result of these competitive devaluations is such that it's really difficult now to envisage an export manufacturing sector in particular to be sustained in the short term without some support or some reaction from government, which frankly has been too slow in arriving. Empirical data shows us it takes about 12 months before the full impacts of currency movements are felt in the real economy. The window for action to address the problem is therefore rapidly closing. A coordinated policy of wage reductions across both private and public sectors would provide a significant boost to Ireland's competitive position, and it's happening. That's the point of when I said at the start that we actually can become more competitive and have started that process. At the very least, what we should have as a target in this relative concept is returning our unit labour costs to the EU average. A reduction in wages would result in similar declines in both consumer prices and business costs, along with declines in consumer prices and business costs, would reduce the cost of living and address Ireland's high cost of doing business. Here's what I want to acknowledge. A policy of wage reduction could, of course, have very significant downsides. It would involve considerable pain for households, particularly those with high debt levels. It would further erode the income tax revenues of the country at a time when our public finances are distressed, and it could possibly lead to a damaging deflationary spiral. However, irrespective of the policy pursued and non-policies pursued, it is inevitable that living standards in our country will fall. A reduction in wages and prices would help preserve employment in the short term and would leave Ireland in a position, well positioned to benefit from improved export opportunities over the coming years. I want to make a sobering point in terms of the Irish export performance at the moment. Irish exports are doing relatively well in contrast to other countries, but the dominant force there is in the pharmaceutical industry. And one of the things that's very under-acknowledged in the wider public is that a lot of the companies who are based here in Ireland are facing what they describe as their patent cliff in the next couple of years, when a lot of the products in which they produce are going to run out of patent, and they won't be not necessarily in a position to replace them. The consequences of when you strip out that exceptional industry is that Irish exports are performing, the indigenous ones are performing just along with the trend in world trade, which is now falling at around 15%. So we should not be too complacent when we see the balance of payments correcting. There are exceptional circumstances at work, and David made mention of the fact that it's as much that imports are imploding as any strength in the core export performance of the Irish economy. So there isn't much succour in the competitors' argument at the moment in looking at our exports. While wage cuts will undoubtedly help restore lost competitiveness, wage cuts in isolation will not fully address our difficulties. The unit costs of our goods and services can be reduced in other ways. Education and training, research development, provision of world-class infrastructure, as Annette has just been talking about there, reasonably priced energy, and flexible work practices are all critical from a competitiveness perspective. In a time of exceptional stress for our public finances, it's not going to be possible to address these issues simply through the provision of additional resources. And here becomes where the innovation piece becomes crucial for Ireland in terms of the innovation of us as a society that can react and adapt to this world of less resources and producing more. The McCarthy report sets out a painful programme of adjustments for all sections of society. Every household, every worker, every business will have to adjust to a radically changed public expenditure environment. In short, we're going to have to do more for less in order to limit the damage to our living standards and return the path to sustainable economic growth. The Irish business community is concerned, and our concerns in relation to investment in education, research, development, infrastructure and energy costs are well documented, and I won't dwell on them further today. Suffice to say they are some of the most crucial and critical building blocks in our efforts to reserve the recent competitive loss. The issue that I would like to just finish up with is about workplace flexibility and productivity. And the story here is a mixed bag, but there are some very positives in terms of the adaptation of Irish people to the crisis in which we're facing. And we have had a first mover advantage in this, that the crisis in the Irish economy has been percolating now for about 2 years. The shock of what has been happening to us at each time and each twist makes us believe that it might actually only be a phenomenon since last autumn. And I think that's been such a huge shock to our system that we have forgotten that the actual turbulence in the Irish economy had set off back with the global credit crunch back in August 2007, which is a long time ago. Aer Lingus have left Shannon and come back in that time, just to put it in perspective. The issue that workplace flexibility is through improved work practices, process improvements and workplace innovation, unit cost of production can be substantially reduced. This doesn't only apply to widget manufacturing companies. All services businesses and the public sector can achieve similar improvements in productivity levels. The biggest obstacles to achieving such productivity improvements are management competency and workplace culture. In times of plenty, many organisations were not run as efficiently as they could have been. For private sector business, profits often flowed even when companies were not operating at their optimum. In the public sector, the use it or lose it approach to budgeting meant that the value for money was often a secondary concern. In the current economic climate, there is no room for suboptimal management. World-class management practices are needed now more than ever to ensure that businesses remain viable and as much employment as possible is preserved. In the public sector in particular, managers must rise to the challenge now of ensuring that lower levels of expenditure do not result in poorer quality provision of frontline services. During the Celtic Tiger years, many workers were rightly envious of the large profits made in some sectors of the economy. Employment opportunities were plentiful and job security no longer carried the value of previous times. Workplace cultures were impacted by the excesses of society in general. The current challenge we face is to provide an opportunity for everyone to bring the renewed commitment and energy to our workplaces. Through working smarter and more flexibly, all employees can improve their productivity levels of their organisation. If this cultural change can be achieved right across the economy, the boost to national competitiveness will be substantial. Up to now, change has been slow and cumbersome, especially in the public sector and in unionised employments in the private sector in particular. There is no doubt that this has impacted negatively on our competitiveness and employment preservation prospects. Finding success again will result in people cooperating, both at national and at enterprise level, to compete effectively on global markets. The reality, and it has been a reality, is that you see that in non-unionised companies, implementation of change has been much more faster and much more effective. It's been a key to success in many organisations in terms of timeliness. We speak about urgency at the national level. That urgency is not a luxury that many private sector firms can afford, and unfortunately even they have not been urgent enough, and we see the tragedy of that in terms of the unemployment levels reaching the heights of 400,000 on our live register and still rising. There will be no quick fixes, just to finish, there will be no quick fixes to Ireland's competitive problems, but like the challenges we face in the banking sectors and with our public finances, we're in for a hard slog over the coming years to undo the damage of recent excesses. It is impossible to ignore costs, including labour costs, in the competitiveness debate, but it would be wrong and very wrong to suggest that reducing wages would be a panacea. We must take a wide-ranging view of competitiveness and all its determinants. Genuine workplace change with a view to boosting productivity can be a win-win option for business, employees, government and society at large. So finally then, our ability to embrace this change across the economy will be a key determinant. I believe that in many pockets of our society we're seeing that adaptation and cooperation taking place between workers and industry. It is reflected in wage developments, yes. We have evidence in the public sector of wage cuts, and that is to be welcomed. We see it in the private sector as well, and we see the need for changing work patterns and productivity enhancements. If we can get this across all sectors of our economy, then unit labour costs will come down without requiring huge draconian cuts in our cost base and our wage base. Without the productivity improvement and workplace change, the need and absolute necessity for labour costs to come down will become more crystallised quicker in our society. So this the cliche that change is the only constant and must be rapidly embraced. Well, if working together we can resolve to get our costs in order and bring a new enthusiasm for change and success in our workplaces, then I am very confident that Ireland's economic fortunes can improve dramatically in the coming years. Resolving our competitive shortcomings will be essential, but it's a collective effort, and I think the critical factor is we must put the unemployment crisis at the absolute top of our agenda. A more competitive economy will provide better employment opportunities. We've been the beneficiaries of that before, and higher and more equal living standards is the possibility to be delivered from such a society in which we have an offer of just a lose-lose situation is one that will not engender any perception of fairness and is one that will be riven by conflict. So I think we have to offer the prospect that the society can do better. It is not just about costs, it is about productivity. And if we believe all we said about ourselves, then I think the innovation to change and to change together will get us out of this. But we have to first of all accept that competitiveness is a reality and it is possible for us to improve it. And the good news is I believe we're already quite a long way on that road. Thank you.